Have you ever heard of a town cursed overnight? In the quiet Midwest, there once stood a small Protestant community where life was simple, strict, and rooted in tradition. But at the edge of town, there lingered an old Catholic statue of the Virgin Mary, weathered, cracked, and unwanted. For years, people mocked it, until one day, they decided to destroy it completely. With hammers and laughter, they shattered the stone and cast its broken body into the town's ancient well. That night, strange things began to happen. Storm clouds gathered, whispers of crying echoed through the streets, and by dawn, every man, woman, and child woke in pain. Headaches, stomach aches, weakness, no one was spared. Doctors were powerless. Fear spread like wildfire. What happened next would transform this proud little town forever and leave behind a legend still whispered today, the haunting of Mary's Well. The town of Hollow Creek lay quietly in the rolling fields of the Midwest. Wooden houses leaned toward each other as though sharing secrets, and the church steeple pierced the sky like a finger pointing heavenward. For generations, the community had been strictly Protestant, their faith woven into every conversation, every decision, every whispered judgment passed across white picket fences. Yet on the edge of Hollow Creek stood a relic of another faith, a statue that had outlived the settlers who first placed it there. It was a weather-worn image of the Virgin Mary, carved by hands long forgotten and left behind by Catholic families who had abandoned the town decades earlier. The statue stood in silence, its once smooth surface pitted by storms, its eyes nearly erased by time. Children often threw stones at it during their walks home from school, daring each other to strike the head or chip away a finger. Adults would frown at the sight, not out of pity but disdain. They saw in the statue a symbol of idolatry, a false image that mocked the purity of their own belief. Among the most outspoken critics was Reverend Thomas Weller, the shepherd of Hollow Creek's single Protestant church. He was tall, with a voice that filled the wooden rafters of his sanctuary, and his words carried the weight of certainty. To him, the Virgin Mary statue was not merely stone, it was temptation, it was corruption. He often declared from the pulpit, "A false idol stands at our border, and as long as it remains, shadows will cling to Hollow Creek." The idea spread through the congregation like fire through dry grass. Families such as the Harrisons, the Millers, and the Whitfields repeated his words at supper tables until even the children spoke of the statue as though it were a dangerous thing. The unease ripened into anger, and anger eventually demanded a solution. One evening, the town gathered at the hall. The building smelled of pine boards and lantern smoke, and the benches creaked beneath the weight of dozens of restless bodies. At the front stood Samuel Whitfield, the elected leader of Hollow Creek. His beard was flecked with gray, and his hands were thick from years of farm labor. He pounded the table for silence. "We cannot abide this any longer," Samuel said, his voice hard. "That statue does not belong to us. It was never ours. It belongs to another faith, one that worships images carved by men. I say it is time we rid ourselves of it once and for all." There were nods and murmurs of approval. Martha Harrison, a woman sharp of tongue and quick of temper, rose to her feet. "Every time I walk past that thing, I feel mocked," she said. "We should have done this years ago. It is nothing but stone, and it offends our Lord." From the back, however, came a quieter voice. Elias Boone, a farmer known for his gentleness, cleared his throat. "It has stood there for generations. My father passed it every day, and so did his. Perhaps it would be wiser to leave it be. After all, it harms no one. Have occurring my scene, it is not a scene not have a cane, it is not as of the pros, and content is that like as than." Martha snapped. "No one? Children throw rocks at it, they laugh at it. If it stands, it teaches them that idolatry is something to play with. Better it be gone than it corrupt our youth." The hall erupted in voices, some rising in agreement, others uneasy. Reverend Weller lifted his hand, and silence returned. His eyes glinted in the lantern light. "Brothers and sisters," Scripture warns us against false images. This statue stands as a reminder of those warnings. We cannot preach against idols while leaving one to rot in our midst. We must destroy it. The vote was taken, and the decision nearly unanimous. Only Elias Boone and his wife Clara abstained, their faces pale in the flickering light. The rest cheered the verdict with a fervor that carried them out into the night, voices echoing against the walls of the church itself. The next evening, men gathered at the edge of town, tools in hand. Samuel Whitfield led them, his hammer heavy at his side. Beside him strode Caleb Miller, a broad-shouldered blacksmith whose arms were corded with muscle. Others followed with crowbars, picks, and ropes. A crowd assembled behind them, women clutching shawls against the cold, children craning their necks to watch. The statue stood in its lonely clearing, its face streaked with shadows from the setting sun. For a moment, no one moved. Then Samuel raised his hammer and brought it down against the stone base. The crack rang out like a gunshot. Caleb struck next, and soon the air filled with the sound of iron against stone, echoing across the fields. Chips flew, dust rose, and the once solid figure began to crumble under the relentless assault. Pieces of the Virgin's robe fell away. Her hands broke at the wrists. Finally, with one last blow from Caleb's hammer, the head split from the shoulders and crashed into the dirt. A cheer rose from the onlookers. A sound of triumph mingled with the nervous laughter of those who felt they had done something both daring and forbidden. "Bring the ropes," Samuel commanded. They lashed the fragments together, dragging the statue's remains through the grass toward the Old Town well. The well had been dug by Hollow Creek's founders, its stones dark with age, its depths long considered mysterious by children who dared not peer too far into the water. It had once been called the Eye of Hollow Creek, but now it was little more than a source of drinking water, its surface reflecting only the moon and the stars. The men heaved the first pieces over the edge, the splash echoing up the stone shaft. More followed, until only the head remained. Samuel himself lifted it, its blank eyes staring up at him. For a fleeting moment, he felt a chill at the back of his neck, as though the stone still carried a presence. He shook it off and hurled the head into the darkness. The water closed over the final piece, rippling once, twice, before stilling. The crowd erupted again, their cheers carrying into the night. Reverend Weller raised his hands in prayer, thanking God for the removal of what he called a blight upon their land. Children laughed and clapped. Women whispered to each other with relief. The men, sweating and breathless, exchanged proud glances. They walked back to town under a sky heavy with clouds, leaving the well behind, silent and full of broken stone. Only Elias Boone lingered. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the empty pedestal where the statue had stood. His wife Clara tugged at his arm, urging him to leave, but he could not shake the feeling that something irreversible had been set in motion. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Elias finally turned away, following the others back into Hollow Creek. The well lay quiet, its waters hiding the shattered image beneath, waiting in silence for the night to come. The town of Hollow Creek slept uneasily after the destruction of the Virgin Mary statue. The evening had been filled with shouts of victory, laughter, and bold declarations of righteousness. Yet once the people returned to their homes, once the lamps were blown out and the beds creaked beneath weary bodies, an unfamiliar heaviness fell across the town. The air grew unnaturally still, as though the world itself held its breath. Samuel Whitfield, proud of his leadership, lay in his bed beside his wife Ruth. The farmhouse walls groaned under the shifting wind, and though Ruth drifted quickly to sleep, Samuel found himself staring at the ceiling. He felt certain that the air carried a strange scent, something faintly metallic, like blood mingled with the sharpness of rain. His eyelids eventually closed, but the rest he sought never came. Dreams carried him into the clearing by the well. The moonlight shone unnaturally bright, reflecting on the water's surface. Standing upon the edge was a woman draped in a robe of deep blue, her hands stretched outward as though pleading for help. Samuel tried to step forward, but his feet were bound to the earth. The woman lifted her face, and though the features were blurred by shadows, he knew instinctively she was weeping. When she opened her mouth to cry out, the sound was not a voice, but the deep groan of the well itself. Samuel woke with a start, sweat soaking his pillow. Elsewhere in town, Caleb Miller, the blacksmith who had struck the heaviest blows against the statue, tossed in his sleep. In his dream, he heard the rhythmic clang of his hammer, but when he looked down, he saw not iron beneath his tool, but pale stone that bled with every strike. The statue's face shifted and became his own, cracking apart piece by piece. A hand, broken at the wrist, reached for him from the floor. He screamed himself awake, his chest heaving, his arms trembling as though he had worked all night. His wife Margaret clutched his shoulder, asking what troubled him, but he could not explain. He only muttered, "It is nothing, go back to sleep," though his heart refused to calm. Children, too, were not spared. Young Emily Harrison dreamt of walking past the pedestal where the statue had once stood. The base was empty, but when she turned, she saw the Virgin's head lying in the grass. Its eyes, worn smooth in life, now glowed faintly like embers. Emily reached out, and as her fingers touched the cold stone, the head whispered her name. She screamed, and her parents rushed to her bedside, finding her trembling and drenched in tears. Martha Harrison hushed her child, rocking her until sleep came again, though Martha herself did not close her eyes the rest of the night. Across Hollow Creek, the dreams followed a pattern. In every home, someone woke, gasping, convinced that shadows had crept into their rooms. Clara Boone, who had pleaded with her husband Elias to oppose the destruction, saw herself standing at the edge of the well. From below came a faint sobbing, like a mother mourning a lost child. She leaned closer, only to see faces drifting beneath the surface of the water, faces of neighbors, friends, and even her own reflection. The water pulled at her, and she felt herself falling forward into the dark. She woke, clutching her chest, heart pounding so violently she thought it might break free. Elias Boone himself dreamt differently. His vision was of the fields beyond the town. He saw corn withering, stalks bending under invisible weight, soil cracking as though drained of life. Above it all loomed the figure of the Virgin in blue, larger than the church itself, her face hidden in shadow. When she raised her arms, the fields burst into flame. Elias collapsed to his knees in the dream, begging for mercy, but the woman remained silent. He woke with tears running down his cheeks, though he could not recall the moment he had begun to cry. By midnight, the storm arrived. Clouds rolled in from the horizon, black and heavy, smothering the stars. Rain lashed the rooftops, rattling windows and filling gutters until they overflowed. The wind roared down the narrow streets like a furious beast, tearing at shutters and howling through chimneys. The townspeople lay awake, tossing on their beds, haunted by images they could not understand. The old well became the center of it all. Those who lived nearest swore they heard sobbing rising from its depths, louder than the storm itself. Others claimed they saw flickers of light, like candles burning deep within the stone shaft. Dogs barked and whined, refusing to be silenced, and horses kicked their stalls in terror. Reverend Thomas Weller sat in his study, Bible open before him. He had fallen asleep at his desk, only to dream of the sanctuary filled with water. The pews floated like driftwood, and from the pulpit rose the broken statue, pieced together yet bleeding from every seam. He woke with the sound of dripping water echoing in his ears, though the study was dry. The lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. He knelt to pray, but the words tangled in his throat. In the Harrison home, Martha clutched her daughter while the storm pounded overhead. She whispered prayers, though they felt hollow in her mouth. Emily whimpered, muttering about glowing eyes, while her father Robert paced the floorboards with restless steps. "It is only the storm," Robert said again and again. though he spoke more to himself than to anyone else. Caleb Miller sat by the window, staring out into the rain. He swore he saw a figure moving along the street, a woman in a blue robe gliding silently through the downpour. She turned her head, and though the rain obscured her features, he felt her eyes pierce directly into his soul. He blinked, and she was gone. Caleb shut the curtains and sank into a chair, trembling. As the night dragged on, the dreams grew more vivid. Some townspeople felt hands pressing against their windows, though no prints remained in the morning. Others heard voices whispering their names, calling them to the well. The storm reached its height just before dawn, a thunderclap shaking the earth and rattling every building in Hollow Creek. Children screamed, men cursed, and women prayed aloud in desperation. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm ceased. The rain tapered to silence, the wind died, and the town was left in an eerie stillness. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, pale and uncertain, casting long shadows across the drenched streets. No one in Hollow Creek had truly slept. They emerged from their homes with tired eyes and heavy hearts, each carrying unspoken images from the night before. Conversations were hushed, glances uneasy. Though no one dared to say it aloud, the town shared a single thought. Something had been unleashed. Morning came to Hollow Creek with a gray, reluctant light. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the soaked fields and dripping rooftops. The air smelled of wet earth, heavy and metallic, clinging to every surface like a warning. People stepped from their houses one by one, eyes sunken, faces pale, bodies bent, as though under some unseen weight. Samuel Whitfield was the first to notice that something was terribly wrong. He tried to rise from bed as he always did, ready to check the fences and feed the livestock, but his stomach twisted with a sharp, stabbing pain. Sweat ran down his temples, even though the morning air was cool. Ruth, his wife, clutched her abdomen as well, her lips pale. "Samuel," she whispered, "what is happening?" He tried to answer but found his head pounding, his vision blurred at the edges. Across town, Caleb Miller struggled to stand at his forge. His arms, so strong the day before, trembled as though he had worked for days without rest. A sickness churned inside him, every breath a labor. Margaret hurried to his side, pressing a hand to his forehead. He was burning with fever. When she opened her mouth to call for help, her own knees buckled, and she fell against him, clutching her chest. The Harrison household was filled with cries. Emily lay in bed, her face flushed, her small hands clutching her stomach. Martha tried to cool her daughter with wet cloths, but her own head throbbed so fiercely she could barely stand. Robert, pacing in panic, suddenly collapsed to his knees, groaning in pain. "It feels as though my skull will split," he gasped, clutching his temples. The illness spared no one. In the Boone home, Elias sat hunched over the table, unable to lift his head. Clara leaned against the wall, her skin clammy, her lips murmuring prayers that faltered with every breath. Outside, neighbors stumbled along the muddy road, their faces contorted with pain, children clinging weakly to their parents' arms. By mid-morning, the entire town knew they were stricken. From house to house spread the same story. Stomach pains that bent even the strongest men, headaches that blinded the most resilient women, fevers that left children whimpering in their beds. It was not like any sickness they had ever known. It came all at once, without warning, and it showed no mercy. Dr. Henry Caldwell, a thin, gray-haired man who had tended Hollow Creek for 20 years, rushed from home to home, carrying his worn leather bag. He checked pulses, examined eyes, listened to chests, and found the same condition everywhere. Sweat, fever, weakness, pain. He gave powders to ease the stomach, tinctures to calm the head, but nothing worked. By the time he returned to his office, his own legs quivered beneath him, and his vision swam. He collapsed into his chair, gripping the edges of the desk as nausea rose within him. Even the doctor was not spared. The church bell rang at noon, its tone heavy and uneven. Reverend Thomas Weller had ordered it rung, hoping to gather those who still had strength enough to walk. Slowly, painfully, men and women dragged themselves into the wooden sanctuary, leaning on each other for support. Children cried quietly in the pews, their faces flushed. The Reverend himself was pale, sweat dripping from his brow, but his voice strained to carry over the groans of the afflicted. "This is a trial," he declared, clutching the pulpit for balance. "The Lord tests us. We must not falter. We must endure." But even as he spoke, his words slurred and his knees buckled. He gripped the wood tightly to keep from collapsing, his eyes darting across the faces of his suffering congregation. Murmurs filled the church. "Why are we all sick?" whispered Martha Harrison to her husband. "Why all at once?" Robert shook his head, pressing his palms to his eyes as though to block out the pounding ache inside his skull. Others asked similar questions, their voices trembling with fear. Elias Boone, weak but determined, lifted his head. "We brought this on ourselves," he rasped. His words carried across the pews, drawing gasps. "We broke the statue. We cast it into the well. And now," he coughed violently, his body shaking, "now we suffer." "Blasphemy," someone muttered. But the word lacked conviction. Even Reverend Weller fell silent, his face pale as he sank slowly to his knees. The weight of doubt pressed heavily upon the room. Outside, the animals of Hollow Creek mirrored the chaos. Cows refused to eat, horses kicked their stalls, dogs whimpered and lay motionless on porches. The sickness had not touched them, but their unease made the air thicker still. The fields, soaked by rain, seemed lifeless, the corn drooping under a sunless sky. By evening, Hollow Creek was a town of groans and whispers. Families lay sprawled across beds, too weak to rise. Fires in hearths burned low, untended. No laughter drifted from porches, no songs carried on the breeze. The entire community was swallowed by pain. Samuel Whitfield, once so strong in his certainty, sat slumped against the wall of his farmhouse. Ruth dabbed his forehead, though her own hands shook uncontrollably. Samuel's lips parted in a broken whisper. "What if Elias is right? What if this is punishment?" Ruth shivered and turned away, unwilling to answer. Caleb Miller could not shake the dream that had plagued him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the Virgin's broken hand reaching for him. He muttered to Margaret in fevered tones, "She will not leave us. She will not forgive." Margaret wept, holding his hand, though her tears burned with her own fever. The Harrisons clung to each other in despair. Emily's cries had grown faint, her voice rasping. Martha begged Robert to pray, but his words stumbled. "What prayer can help us now?" he said bitterly, his face twisted in pain. "We brought this upon ourselves." Even Reverend Weller, in the darkness of his parsonage, lay shivering beneath his blankets. His lips moved in prayer, but the words faltered, dissolving into moans. He dreamed again of water filling the sanctuary, of the statue rising from the pulpit, eyes glowing with sorrow and fury. When he woke, the sound of dripping filled his ears once more, though the room was dry. The night fell heavy. Hollow Creek lay silent except for the occasional cry of pain. No light shone from the windows, no laughter, no song, no comfort remained. A fear deeper than sickness gripped the town. They all felt it but did not speak it. The illness was not natural. It was a shadow cast by what they had done. The well sat quietly at the edge of town, the broken pieces of stone resting deep in its water. The storm had passed, but something else had risen, something unseen, lingering and merciless. The sickness did not fade with time. Instead, it clung stubbornly to Hollow Creek, turning each passing day into a deeper descent into despair. The once bustling streets grew empty, save for a few figures moving slowly between houses to check on neighbors. Voices were hushed, footsteps uncertain. The town that had once been so proud, so confident in its faith, now trembled like a child lost in the dark. By the third day, rumors had begun to spread. They slipped from one household to another like smoke curling through cracks in the wall. The words carried fear, shame, and anger in equal measure. Mothers whispered while holding their children close, fathers muttered between groans of pain, and elders shook their heads with trembling hands. "It is the water," some said. "The storm poisoned the well, and now we are paying the price." "No," others insisted. "It came after the statue was broken. That was the moment everything changed." "Redilia, it is Smalus." The name of the Virgin Mary, once mocked and spat upon, began to slip back into conversations. At first, it was spoken cautiously, as though saying it too loudly might invite more pain. But soon it grew into bolder accusations, not against her, but against those who had destroyed her likeness. In the Harrison home, Robert sat hunched at the table, his head cradled in his hands. Martha leaned against the wall, pale but restless. Emily dozed fitfully in her bed, her small body still shivering with fever. "I keep hearing it," Martha whispered, her voice raw. "Hearing what?" Robert asked, his eyes bloodshot. "The sound of water, dripping, even when there is none. And sometimes I swear I hear crying. It comes from the direction of the well." Robert groaned. "It is your imagination. The storm shook us all. Our minds are playing tricks." Martha's eyes hardened. "Then why are we all sick, Robert? Why every single one of us? Does that not trouble you?" Robert had no answer. He only tightened his grip on his head, groaning as another wave of pain shot through his skull. On the far side of town, Clara Boone stood at her window, her hands clasped tightly together. Her husband Elias sat weakly nearby, too ill to rise. Clara's gaze was fixed on the distant clearing where the statue had once stood. She thought of the dreams that haunted her sleep, the sobbing from the well, the faces beneath the water. When neighbors came to check on them, Clara's voice carried a warning. "You all know what this island, you know why this is happening. We brought this sickness upon ourselves when we mocked her. You threw her into the well, and now the well itself curses us." Her words unsettled those who heard them. Some shook their heads and hurried away, unwilling to listen. Others carried her warning back to their families, whispering it as though repeating a secret too dangerous to say aloud. Soon, the entire town knew that Clara Boone, the Catholic widow, had spoken. She was the only one left who had ever lit a candle at the statue in years past, the only one who had quietly muttered prayers when others mocked. Now her faith gave her words a strange power. At the Miller home, Caleb lay sweating, his face twisted in fever. Margaret sat beside him, wringing her hands. When their neighbor, Jonathan Pierce, arrived to ask after them, Margaret leaned close and whispered, "Clara says this is punishment. She says we angered the Virgin when we threw her statue into the well." Jonathan's eyes widened. "You should not repeat such things." "But what if she is right?" Margaret's voice trembled. "What if this is not a sickness at all but a curse? What if we cannot escape it until we make it right?" Jonathan shook his head violently. "Blasphemy! We destroyed that idol for good reason. Do you mean to say God would punish us for obeying his commandment?" Yet, even as he spoke, his lips quivered and his eyes darted toward the window as though he feared something might be listening. In the church, Reverend Weller attempted to gather the faithful once again, but the pews were half empty. Those who came sat hunched and silent, their faces filled with doubt. The Reverend's voice was weak, trembling from illness, but he pressed on. "Do not listen to foolish talk," he said. "This is a trial, nothing more. It is not punishment. We are faithful, and the Lord will deliver us." From the back of the sanctuary, Clara Boone's voice cut through the air like a blade. She had come, wrapped in a black shawl, her face pale, but her eyes burning. "You tell them not to listen," she said, her voice firm. "But you know as well as I do that this is no ordinary illness. Look at us. Look at what has become of Hollow Creek. Do you still believe this is only a trial?" The congregation turned, murmurs rising. Reverend Weller's face flushed. "Clara, enough. You bring fear into this house of God." Clara stepped forward, leaning heavily on her cane but unyielding. "Fear is already here, Reverend. It came the night you cast her into the well. You thought she was only stone, but she was more than that. She was a symbol, a presence, and you mocked her. Now the presence mocks you in return." Gasps rippled through the church. Martha Harrison buried her face in her hands, while Robert shifted uneasily. Caleb Miller groaned from his pew, his fever-racked body slumping against Margaret's shoulder. Reverend Weller slammed his hand against the pulpit. "This is heresy," he thundered, though his voice cracked with weakness. "Do not listen to this woman. The Lord will see us through." But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with doubt, with fear, with the memory of dreams that haunted him each night. The meeting dissolved into whispers, some agreeing with Clara, others denouncing her. Families left the church in silence, too exhausted to argue, but too shaken to ignore the seed of doubt planted in their minds. That night, Hollow Creek buzzed with quiet speculation. In kitchens, in parlors, in bedrooms where families lay huddled in sickness, Clara Boone's words repeated themselves. Mothers told their husbands, fathers told their sons. Children, half asleep, murmured about glowing eyes and the sound of crying near the well. The rumor spread further. Some claimed they had seen a woman in blue walking through the storm. Others swore they heard her voice calling from the water. Each telling grew darker, each whisper more urgent, until fear wrapped itself around Hollow Creek like a shroud. By the end of the week, the town was no longer united. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, arguments broke out in hushed tones, and the once solid authority of Reverend Weller began to fracture. Clara Boone, frail but unyielding, became the center of every conversation, her warnings carried from door to door, street to street. And through it all, the sickness deepened, clinging to every household. Hollow Creek lay in the grip of dread, torn between faith and fear, between denial and belief. And at the edge of town, the well remained silent, its waters dark, hiding the broken fragments that had awakened something the townspeople could no longer deny. The days dragged on, and the sickness did not loosen its grip. Hollow Creek was now a town of shadows. Smoke no longer curled from chimneys because fires went untended. Livestock roamed without proper care, fields lay unplowed, and the once proud church bell tolled only when someone collapsed in their home, begging for neighbors to come. Clara Boone's words continued to echo in every corner of the town. People tried to resist them, but in the silence of night, when dreams pressed heavily upon their minds, her warning returned. The statue had been more than stone, and by casting it into the well, they had called something upon themselves that no medicine could cure. At first, there was denial. Reverend Weller still preached each Sabbath that their strength lay in holding firm, that to give in to fear was to dishonor God. Yet his own body betrayed him. He was gaunt, his voice cracked, his hands trembled as he clung to the pulpit. The congregation no longer believed his certainty. Their eyes shifted to one another instead, searching for answers he could not provide. It was Samuel Whitfield who finally spoke the words no one else dared to say. On a rain-soaked afternoon, he called the townsfolk to gather at the hall. The benches creaked under their weight, and the lantern light flickered against pale, drawn faces. Samuel himself leaned heavily on the table, his cheeks hollowed by sickness, but his eyes burned with resolve. "We are dying," he said, his voice low but steady. "No doctor, no prayer, no fasting has freed us. You all know why. Clara Boone has spoken the truth we did not wish to hear. We broke the statue, we cast her into the well, and now we are cursed. Nos slash ungovars swij novalo is the novindast." A murmur spread, a wave of voices rising and falling. Some denied it, shaking their heads violently, but their protests were weak. Others looked to Clara, who sat wrapped in her shawl, silent but unyielding. "What would you have us do?" asked Robert Harrison, his voice cracked from fever. Samuel straightened. "We must restore what we destroyed. We must rebuild the statue. Only then might this curse be lifted." Caleb Miller groaned from the corner where he sat slumped. "You would have us bow to an idol?" "No," Samuel said sharply. I would have us save our children. Look at them half dead in their beds. If rebuilding that statue is the only path to their healing, then we must take it. Call it repentance, call it foolishness, I do not care. But we must act." The room fell silent. Eyes shifted between Reverend Weller and Clara Boone. The Reverend shook his head, his lips trembling. "This is not the way," he muttered, but his voice lacked fire, and the people did not cling to his words as they once had. Clara Boone lifted her chin, her eyes shining. "You know what must be done. The Virgin waits." That night, the decision was made. Hollow Creek would rebuild the statue. The following morning, despite their weakness, a group of men rode to the nearby county seat to find stonecutters. They returned with 2 Italian craftsmen, brothers named Marco and Angelo Rinaldi, who had settled in America years before. The brothers listened quietly as the townspeople explained what had happened. Their faces grew pale, but they accepted the work, their Catholic heritage stirring unease at what they heard. The town provided what they could: blocks of limestone hauled from a quarry nearby, tools from Caleb Miller's forge, and food offered by families who had little to spare. Marco and Angelo set up their work near the square, chisels ringing out through the silent streets. Every strike echoed like penance, each fragment of stone falling to the ground like confession. The people gathered daily to watch, some whispering prayers under their breath, others only staring with hollow eyes. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their cheeks pale but their eyes wide. Even Reverend Weller came, standing apart with his arms crossed, his face a mask of inner conflict. Day by day, the statue began to take form. A base was carved, tall and strong. From the stone rose the folds of a robe, a bowed head, and hands stretched outward in silent plea. The Virgin's face emerged slowly, each line etched with care. The Rinaldi brothers worked tirelessly, their own devotion etched into the stone as much as their tools. As the statue grew, so did the tension in Hollow Creek. Families whispered about what it would mean when it stood completed. Some feared it would anger God further. Others clung to hope that it was their only salvation. Arguments broke out in kitchens, prayers grew louder in bedrooms, and the air itself felt charged with expectation. When the final day came, the town gathered in the square. The statue, taller than any man, gleamed pale in the late afternoon sun. Marco and Angelo wiped the dust from their hands and stepped aside. Samuel Whitfield, thin and weak but determined, raised his hand. "Today we restore what we have broken," he said. His voice cracked, but the words carried. Men pulled ropes, straining as they lifted the statue onto its pedestal in the square. The sound of wood creaked, ropes stretched, and with one last heave, the Virgin Mary rose to stand above them once more. Her face gazed downward, serene yet sorrowful, her hands open as if offering both judgment and mercy. Silence fell across the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. Then Clara Boone stepped forward, lighting a candle she had kept hidden for years. She set it at the statue's feet, her hands trembling. "Forgive us," she whispered. One by one, others followed. Martha Harrison laid flowers she had gathered from her garden. Caleb Miller, tears streaking his fevered face, bowed his head, unable to speak. Robert Harrison gripped his daughter's hand, helping her lay a ribbon of blue cloth at the base. Even Reverend Weller, though reluctant, placed his hand against the cold stone and whispered a prayer so quiet no one else could hear. As dusk fell, the statue stood surrounded by flickering candles, their flames casting soft light across the Virgin's sorrowful face. The people of Hollow Creek remained in the square long into the night, unwilling to leave. They prayed clumsily, stumbling over words they had never spoken before, their voices trembling with fear and hope intertwined. The air shifted as the last light faded. A breeze carried the faint scent of roses, though no roses grew nearby. The townspeople inhaled sharply, glancing at one another, their eyes wide. Something had changed, something unseen, as though the town itself held its breath. Hollow Creek had rebuilt the statue, but none knew if their act was enough. They returned to their homes quietly, hearts pounding, uncertain of what the morning would bring. When darkness fell upon Hollow Creek, the new statue of the Virgin Mary stood tall in the center of the square, lit by dozens of trembling candles. The townspeople lingered long after dusk, their eyes fixed upon the stone figure as though afraid that if they turned away, it might vanish. The air was strangely calm. The storm clouds that had plagued the town in recent weeks had parted, leaving the sky sharp and clear, the stars gleaming like scattered shards of glass. Clara Boone sat at the front of the crowd, her shawl wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders. Her eyes never left the Virgin's face. She whispered prayers in a language unfamiliar to most of Hollow Creek, words she had carried since childhood. The flames flickered against her pale cheeks, and she felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. Samuel Whitfield stood nearby, one hand gripping the arm of his wife Ruth for support. His body still ached, his head still burned with fever, but something stirred within him as he stared at the statue. He felt as though a presence hovered in the square, unseen but undeniable. He leaned toward Ruth and whispered, "Do you feel it?" Ruth only nodded, her eyes wide, tears welling as though some buried sorrow had surfaced. Around them, families knelt. The Harrisons held little Emily between them, her small hands folded in prayer. Robert's lips moved silently, though the words caught in his throat. Martha brushed her daughter's damp hair from her face, whispering promises that everything would be all right. Emily opened her eyes, weak but steady, and gazed at the Virgin with wonder. "She is watching," the child murmured. Caleb Miller, his massive frame hunched with exhaustion, lowered himself to his knees. Margaret knelt beside him, clutching his trembling hands. For days he had been consumed with fever, but as the candlelight danced across the Virgin's carved face, a strange calm came over him. His breathing steadied, his skin cooled. He gasped and pressed his hand to his chest. "It is easing," he whispered. Margaret cried out softly, kissing his hands as tears fell freely down her cheeks. Reverend Thomas Weller remained apart, leaning against the steps of the church. His eyes were shadowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had resisted this moment, fought it with scripture and sermons, but now, as he watched his flock kneel before the statue, something within him broke. He sank slowly to the ground, his knees pressing into the dirt, his head bowing despite himself. His words were barely audible. "Lord, forgive me if I have been blind." The candles flickered, their flames bending though no wind stirred. Then a fragrance drifted through the air. It was faint at first, almost imagined, but soon unmistakable. The scent of roses, sweet and pure. Hollow Creek had no roses in bloom, the last of them had withered with the early frost. Yet the fragrance grew stronger, weaving through the crowd, settling into every breath. People inhaled sharply, glancing at one another with wide eyes. Children whispered of gardens, mothers clutched their hands to their hearts, and men who had been hardened by years of labor found themselves trembling. A hush fell across the square. No one spoke, for they all felt the same thing, the presence of something beyond themselves. Some swore later that they saw a faint glow surrounding the statue, a soft radiance that shimmered like moonlight upon water. Others claimed they heard whispers, gentle and sorrowful, though no words could be understood. The hours passed, but no one left. Families huddled together on the cold ground, unwilling to abandon the statue. The flames burned low, yet the air remained warm, as though the night itself had been gentled. Children who had cried themselves to sleep in recent nights now rested peacefully in their mothers' arms. The groans of pain that had filled Hollow Creek for weeks quieted, replaced by silence, broken only by the crackle of candle wicks. Samuel Whitfield rose with difficulty, his body trembling. He raised his hand toward the statue. "If this is mercy," he said softly, his voice shaking, "then we will never turn from it again." His words carried, and though not all repeated them aloud, every heart echoed them in silence. As midnight approached, the fragrance of roses deepened. Clara Boone, her eyes closed, felt tears slide down her wrinkled cheeks. She thought of the years she had spent lighting candles in secret, of the ridicule she had endured, of the statue lying broken at the bottom of the well. Now, as the new figure stood restored, she felt peace settle over her like a blanket. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice breaking with emotion. When the clock in the church tower struck 12, a strange stillness filled the square. The candles, nearly spent, burned brighter for a moment, their flames steady as stone. The Virgin's carved eyes seemed almost alive in the glow, her sorrowful gaze lifting slightly as though to meet those gathered. A ripple of awe passed through the crowd. No one dared move. Then, as though carried on an unseen wind, the scent of roses spread through every street of Hollow Creek, seeping into every house, every room where the sick lay restless. Children stirred in their beds, their fevers breaking. Old men gasped as the weight lifted from their chests. Women sat up, no longer doubled in pain. One by one, households realized what was happening. The illness that had clung to them like a chain was slipping away. In the Harrison home, Emily awoke, her cheeks flushed not with fever but with life. She sat up, startling her mother. "Mama," she whispered, her voice clear, "it does not hurt anymore." Martha pulled her into her arms, sobbing with relief. Robert, tears streaking his face, fell to his knees beside them, unable to speak. At the Miller home, Caleb rose from his bed for the first time in weeks. He stretched his arms, astonished by the strength returning to his body. Margaret clung to him, laughter and tears mingling as she kissed his face. "It is gone," he said, his voice breaking. "The sickness is gone." Even Dr. Caldwell, who had lain weak and helpless in his office, stirred awake with clear eyes and steady hands. He rose slowly, stunned to find the pain had vanished. He walked into the street, joining neighbors who emerged from their homes in disbelief, calling to one another in voices filled with joy. By dawn, the transformation was complete. Hollow Creek, which had been a town of suffering, was now a town reborn. Families stood together in the square, gazing at the statue bathed in morning light. Their faces shone with relief, with wonder, with a fear transformed into reverence. The sickness was gone. The curse, if it had been one, had lifted. But the memory of what they had endured remained carved into their hearts as deeply as the stone of the Virgin's face. The morning after the sickness vanished, Hollow Creek awoke to a silence unlike any it had known before. Not the silence of despair, nor the silence of pain, but a stillness filled with awe. The townspeople stepped cautiously into the streets, touching their own foreheads, their stomachs, their chests, as though expecting the pain to return at any moment. Yet it did not. The illness that had gripped every soul was gone. The air felt different, lighter, almost sweet, as if the fragrance of roses still lingered, though no flowers bloomed. Samuel Whitfield walked slowly to the square, his wife Ruth at his side. He looked older than his years, worn by the trial, but when his eyes fell on the statue standing tall against the morning sun, he straightened his back. "She stands, and so do we," he said quietly. Ruth squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. Families began to gather in the square, drawn by an invisible thread. The Harrisons came first, Robert carrying little Emily in his arms. The child laughed, a sound the town had not heard in weeks, and reached toward the statue with her small hands. Martha wept openly, unable to contain her relief. "She saved us," Emily said, with the unshakable certainty only a child can possess. Caleb Miller emerged from his home, Margaret supporting him, though his steps were firm. He paused before the statue, his large frame trembling. He had doubted, he had mocked, but now his knees bent, and he bowed his head. Margaret knelt beside him, tears streaming, whispering prayers she never thought she would speak. Dr. Henry Caldwell, who had thought himself near death only days before, stood in the crowd with clear eyes and steady hands. He marveled at what no medicine, no science could explain. "I can treat fever, but I cannot banish it from an entire town," he murmured. This was something else. He did not say more, for words felt insufficient. Reverend Thomas Weller approached last, his Bible pressed to his chest. His face was pale, his expression haunted, but his steps carried him forward. He stopped before the statue, staring up into the carved eyes that seemed to gaze down with sorrow and mercy alike. He opened his mouth, but the sermon that rose died in his throat. Instead, he knelt slowly in the dirt, pressing his forehead to the ground. The congregation that once looked to him for guidance now followed his example, and soon the entire square was filled with kneeling figures, their whispers rising like incense. From that day forward, Hollow Creek was never the same. The Virgin Mary's statue became the heart of the town. Each morning, families placed fresh flowers at her feet. Each evening, candles burned until the wax melted onto the stones. No one dared neglect her again. Samuel Whitfield declared that on the anniversary of the night the sickness ended, Hollow Creek would hold a procession. The townspeople agreed. When the day arrived, they carried lanterns and sang hymns through the streets, circling the square before kneeling before the statue. Even those who struggled with the meaning of it all found themselves swept into the devotion, their hearts bound by gratitude and fear. Year after year, the procession grew. Word spread beyond Hollow Creek. Travelers passing through the region heard the story, some dismissing it as superstition, others curious enough to see for themselves. Those who came often left with strange tales. A farmer from the next county swore he saw the statue's face glisten as though tears had carved paths down its stone cheeks. A merchant claimed that when he bent to drink from the old well, the water tasted of roses. A group of children, daring each other late at night, insisted they saw a woman in blue standing by the well, her form shimmering before vanishing into the shadows. The well itself became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Though the townspeople still drew water from it, they treated it with reverence. No one threw stones into its depths, no one mocked its still surface. Some left ribbons tied to the wooden frame, others dropped coins into the water as offerings. Clara Boone, frail and near the end of her life, often sat beside it, her shawl wrapped tightly, her lips murmuring prayers. She became a living reminder of the night Hollow Creek turned from pride to humility. When she passed away, the town buried her near the clearing where the first statue had once stood, marking her grave with roses that seemed to bloom longer than any others. The children of Hollow Creek grew up with the legend of Mary's Well. They told it around campfires, their voices hushed, eyes wide with fear and wonder. Some spoke of the curse, warning that to mock the Virgin was to invite suffering. Others told of mercy, of how forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. The story became a thread woven into the fabric of the town, a tale told and retold until it became indistinguishable from truth. Yet the presence of the Virgin did not fade. Travelers who came through Hollow Creek often reported strange experiences. Some felt watched as they walked the streets at night. Others smelled roses on the wind, even in the dead of winter. A few swore they saw a figure kneeling at the statue when no one else was there, a woman draped in blue, her head bowed in eternal prayer. Reverend Weller, who had once denounced the statue, changed in those final years. His sermons grew quieter, less about condemnation and more about humility. He no longer thundered against idols. Instead, he spoke of mysteries, of the limits of human understanding, of the need to approach faith with trembling reverence. When he died, the town buried him beneath the shadow of the statue, as if to seal the reconciliation of his soul. Hollow Creek prospered after the curse lifted. The fields grew fertile again, the livestock thrived, and children filled the streets with laughter. Yet no one forgot. Each year, on the night of the procession, they carried candles to the well, their flames glowing in the darkness like stars fallen to earth. They sang softly, their voices carrying into the night, and they whispered prayers both fearful and grateful. And still, when the moon hung high and the air grew heavy, there were those who swore they saw her. A figure in blue standing at the edge of the well, her gaze sorrowful yet kind, her hands extended as if forever offering mercy. Hollow Creek no longer mocked her. They called the well by a new name, one that carried both reverence and warning. Outsiders whispered it, travelers repeated it, and the children of Hollow Creek grew up never knowing the well by any other title. It was, and always would be, Mary's Well.